YouTube is pretty quick.
Well, not in the New Testament, so I don't know what I'm doing there.
And I think we're good on Facebook.
Oh, do you see it on? Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay. I was looking in the wrong place on YouTube.
Yeah,
There we are. Comments in case. And then. Oh, do you see it? Facebook. Oh, yeah, I see it. Okay.
Yeah.
I was looking in the wrong place on YouTube. And let's do a quick share.
It's coming through.
Oh, that's
the
where
speaker
that's.
through your phone.
Thank you. I couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. And I had my phone hooked up to our speaker, so it was our voices were broadcasting in our living room.
Oh, that's funny. Right.
Awesome.
And then, oh, I want to share as me, but it won't let me. That's a bit weird.
Through today.
Hmm?
Oh, because.
Ah, there we go. Okay. All right. The story so far.
All right.
And I should put Zoom on that view so people can see us without it flicking around and looking weird. Okay. Yeah, so it was me and Molly last week, wasn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
So last week was fun because I had an old friend who's actually a pastor in Africa jump on and join in. So that was a little bit different.
That's fun.
Yeah.
You grab something real fast, actually.
And he's gone.
Okay. Well, at least I can see comments now. Right.
Write about something.
Man, it's just, I keep looking at the wrong, because there's a delay on YouTube and Facebook. And if I'm not actually looking at Zoom, then you guys talk and then your mouths don't move and you look like a really badly dubbed martial arts film. So, which would be pretty funny, but not quite what we need at the end of the day when we're getting confused.
Yes. It's been a
So
long
story, we should do a quick story so far, which
Yes.
is going to have to get shorter each time we do this because
All right.
the stories, we're getting further into it. But so we've had Hannah, amazing woman of God, and her prayer and the way God comes through, and Samuel appears on the scene. And then it's kind of a game of contrasts. We've got Samuel and Hannah contrasted with the house of Eli and yeah, and I'm not going to repeat it all because that's the beauty of it being available and recorded. If you missed it, you can listen to it. But yeah, loads of interesting contrasts. And last week we had the downfall of Eli's house and the ark, and that's where the story leaves us. Is like, so the most powerful priestly family. Well, never mind priestly family. You know, this priestly family is really the leaders of the nation. So just the most powerful family is brought to nothing. And the most precious, sacred, important object, the Ark of the Covenant, is also taken. So Israel is left kind of, pretty bereft, and it's like supreme tragedy and loss. But we're left like wondering, well, what now? You know, is that it? Are we doomed? Kind of thing. Because that's what it would have felt like to them a little bit, I think. And you get the child Ichabod and all there's some really cool plays on words with the kabod kind of variations on that theme at the end of the last chapter, which is kind of cool, which again we unpacked last week. But that it's kind of, this child is born and it poses the question for us, like, what's glorious about Israel now, and where's the kind of weight, like where's the influence, where's the power going to come from now? Because we got nothing. Like we've lost the family that maybe power could have come from, and we've lost the ark that power could have come from. So like they're kind of powerless. Yeah. And so yeah. And it's really interesting, like thinking about the way an Israelite would read this history and this story compared to someone who wasn't an Israelite. Because an Israelite may be like primarily interested in what's going to happen to them, you know, and their national heritage. Whereas an outsider, which is a little bit more us probably, is like, well, what's up with God now? Because if God's throne has been taken to another place, then it's almost as if God's been exiled from his own nation. So we're wondering, like, and especially from like an ancient Philistines point of view, because they're like, oh, well, we won. So I guess like our God was bigger than your God.
Yeah.
You know, our God beat up your God. So, you know, how's the story going to play out? We're wondering, oh, you know, is God actually not the supreme good guy and powerful one that we thought he was in this story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You wanted to share?
Oh no, I will. Yeah, we'll get to it.
Yeah. Well, we'll actually get into chapter 5 here. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to just flag this up before we even start reading. It really got me thinking about how God effectively has been exiled, and how there's a real correlation between, there's like language from Exodus that's being used here, like the people cry out the same way they did in Egypt, and God is like sent out of the land away from the Philistines the way the Israelites are sent out from Egypt.
Right.
And it's almost like God's journey here into supposed slavery to this god Dagon, and then supernaturally overcoming it, and then being sent out, and then supernaturally entering back into the resting place where he's supposed to be. It's like a little microcosm of the Exodus story. So I don't know what to make of it, but once I saw a couple of clues, I was like, oh, this is like riffing on Exodus. That's really interesting. I wonder why. So answers on a postcard.
Yeah.
if you know why. Maybe we'll notice as we read through. I actually noticed that just only a little while ago, and so I haven't really thought about it yet, but I thought it was really interesting. So I'm going to throw that one out, put that on the table as something that could be interesting.
Yeah.
Right, should we read a bit?
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, one of you two, I've just said loads, so one of you two
I
read
can go ahead and start.
whatever the first section should be.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so starting in verse 1. After the Philistines had captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer to Ashdod, brought it into the temple of Dagon, and placed it next to his statue. When the people of Ashdod got up early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and returned him to his place. But when they got up early the next morning, there was Dagon, fallen with his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. This time, Dagon's head and both of his hands were broken off and lying on the threshold. Only Dagon's torso remained. That is why, still today, the priests of Dagon and everyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod do not step on Dagon's threshold.
Okay. So this is some weird ancient world stuff that.
This is some of my favorite,
class,
one
right?
of my favorite stories in the Old Testament.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're going to get this in a minute in the next chapter where the Israelites are kind of touching and looking at the ark and they die.
Yeah.
And we had it already in Deuteronomy where people touch the ark and die. And here's a bunch of Philistines picking up the ark and carrying off as the spoils of war. And they're not dying. So they're surprise number one to me. which I think you start to notice some details where like this, like what God's holding other nations to and what he's holding his people to is a little different.
Mhm.
Like he's got some different standards of the Israelites because A, they're supposed to be his people and they've entered into this covenant, and B, he's actually told them, whereas the others may be, you know, ignorant or might not know. So yeah.
Yeah, well, the thing that I find so interesting about this is how quickly it comes off the heels of Eli falling over. I just thought about this today as we were thinking, like, as we were just kind of talking even briefly, like, oh, hey, we're like, okay, it's going to be chapter 5 today. This is what just happened in chapter 4. We weren't there to talk about it. And suddenly, yeah, just picking up on the fact that, like, so end of chapter 4, Eli falls over. It mentions that he's heavy, which is the Hebrew word kavod, which is the word that it sounds like you guys talked about that a little bit last week. Kind of,
Yeah, this kind of play on words.
Yeah, a ton of riffing on this sort of thing. Like it's interesting because it's helpful. Like Tim Mackey always talks about this whenever anybody asks, like, oh, what does the glory of the Lord mean? He's like, well, the Hebrew word for glory is just kavod. It's has like a kind of normal usage, even not just a religious or spiritual usage. You can get this when Eli falls over and it says that he fell over and broke his neck because he was heavy. Like, so it kind of just means like heavy, weighty, or even like fat or something like that. It can be used in that kind of way. But I do think there's more than even just that kind of like usage going on in Eli. Like he's received the news that the ark has been stolen, and that's like the glory of the Lord. The heaviness of the Lord is there.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna take my dog and put him in the other room.
Wow, of all the times.
He's really excited we're sitting together, clearly.
Someone would like you to center attention.
So funny.
Go on, Ryan. I'm sorry.
That's fine. So
yeah, because it's almost like actually this Hebrew word kabod actually semantically functions very similarly to the word weighty. Like it can be influential, you know, of substance because of their influence or power or things like that, or it can just mean like, yeah, you put it on the scales and it weighs a lot, you know.
Yeah.
And it enables the author here to actually throw out both of those for us to think about. Why, you know, what's the important fact about Eli?
All of these normal uses and then these like really like more spiritual uses, or you know, what to indicate what the Lord is doing, and you're left just to kind of have to think through the weightiness of how that word is being used, sometimes flippantly and sometimes with a weightiness, even the way it's being used. But so like that happens, like this, you know, essentially the image of God. I mean, obviously humans are made in the image of God, but this kind of like place that is supposed to represent the presence and the image of God, like this thing, you know, is stolen and then placed now in this chapter in the presence of another kind of statue or like kind of figurine or whatever to represent this god Dagon. And what happens when the weightiness of the Lord, the heaviness, the kavod of the Lord is in his presence, is he falls over and he's broken and he dies essentially. And then the very next verse says the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod. And it's that same word. So there's
like this author's favorite word in these chapters. It's like over and over again. Yeah.
He just learned it or something, and he's just like, oh, this is a good one. I can see how it fits in all of this. But yeah, there's clearly something going on with the presence and the weightiness of the Lord. Like we're supposed, it's the watchword for like, okay, we've just now we've witnessed this word again, or we've witnessed something that's supposed to remind us of an occasion in which that word was used. This is kind of like that. Hey, listener, like if you have ears, listen here very closely, peer in, dive deep, and get ready. Like God's doing something here. His weightiness, his glory is here.
Yeah, especially with Ichabod closing out the last chapter with this kind of like, where's the glory, where's the weightiness?
Mhm.
And then in the next chapter, there's one trajectory of the narrative which is like, oh no, God's been taken, God's exiled, like God's fallen.
Mm.
And where's the weightiness? Oh, God's over there with the Philistines being weighty. Like that's where it is. God's doing something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's another interesting kind of, this might be a bit of a tangent, but it's just, there's so many stories in scripture where things look tragic and hard and God starts acting. And actually, I mean, I think there's two things. One is like the way God can redeem and turn around a tragedy and restore things. But the other is just we're constantly bumping into these subplots where actually it seems like God's got some other stuff he wanted to do, that's still really important stuff. Because you get the same thing in the Exodus story, from an Israel-centric point of view, it's about Israel's tragedy and God stepping in and rescuing them. It's their moment of becoming as a nation. But from an Egyptian point of view, like a foreign god wants to have a conversation, a pretty heated conversation about, hey, you're following all of these gods and they're not as powerful as me. Like God wants to communicate with the Egyptians. And you kind of got a similar thing here, which again is this like mirroring of Exodus a little bit, like this pattern where God, he wants to do a thing with Israel, but he goes to sort of great pains here to make sure that no one can mistake the fact that, hey, Dagon's not a real God. Like he's dead. Like there's nothing there. So yeah, I mean it's kind of neat, especially because later on the way Israel would, I don't know, lose the plot a little bit with their mission to go reach the nations and kind of view the other nations as rejected by God. And yet their history is filled with pockets of God doing stuff with Israel, but taking these opportunities to actually communicate truth to these other nations, not just judging them, but actually, like God could have just wiped them out, but he doesn't. He like knocks over Dagon, and he could have just been like, okay, you've seen that, I'm bigger than Dagon, now I can judge you, I want to get out of here, let's get this show on the road. But God's like, oh no, like, okay, you want to put Dagon back up, okay, I'll wait till tomorrow, let's do this again, let's see if you listen to me the second time. So yeah, I like these little subplots.
Well, and it's making me wonder, the thing that struck me about it being so similar to the way Eli falls is it's making me wonder if what then Eli's falling over and dying over the weightiness of what has happened to the ark is like, well, one, I think then there's a play on the heaviness, not just really of Eli's like kind of heavy setness that kills him, but also the heaviness of what's just occurred is what like sent him to an early grave sort of thing. Like he just couldn't handle it. But then also like
that's what orphans his grandson as well.
Yeah.
It's put in the foreground it's the fact that the ark was taken, which tips the scales to, this child being orphaned and losing its mother. So yeah, for sure, we're supposed to think of that.
And is it indicating that perhaps what Eli is being put to death then also is putting to death kind of another idol? Like under Eli's reign was not worship of Yahweh, the true God. It was some weird fake version of what they were calling Yahweh and the way him and his sons were ruling things and doing things in the name of Yahweh, but it wasn't really his character. And
well, especially because we're about to see the Israelites again showing an ignorance or a disregard for what the law says as they're interacting with the ark.
Yeah.
And what do? They copy the Philistines. which
Mm.
is interesting because like having temple prostitution, which was Hophni and Phinehas's deal, is again copying the Philistines. And so it's not just the erosion, like Israel has been forgetful of God's ways. They've actually kind of synthesized God's ways with copying the nations around them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a repeated pattern here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is an interesting one. I also I hadn't thought about like Eli being an idol, but we did talk last week about it sort of evocative, the way that Dagon and Eli both die in the same way.
Yeah.
Because I mean, Eli being portrayed as an idol is pretty bad, but Eli being portrayed as like a central figure of heresy and paganism, no,
Yeah.
it don't get much worse for a
Mhm.
priest to be compared to this. Yeah, I like the I don't know. There's something, maybe naive is the word. I mean, it's just a bit weird, right? So you worship your God and you've got a statue of him in your temple, and they bring the covenant in, the Ark of the Covenant, which is like Yahweh. Like it's the closest they've got to a statue of Yahweh, and they put him beside Dagon because, like, yeah, our God beat up your God. So now the appropriate thing is that your God now serves and attends our God.
Mhm.
So he's going to go in the temple and serve our God. And so God wants to deal with the fact that they've misunderstood who Yahweh is, right? And so, you know, you as a priest, you walk in your temple the next day and your statue of your God has, you know, has fallen over. And not just fallen over, but fallen face first, prostrate in a posture of like worship, submission, you know, before like it's
Yeah.
not an accidental scene, like it's got to make you think. And I just love the fact that they're just like, quick, pick him up, no one will notice. Like
Don't tell anyone.
surely at this point you walk in the temple and you're going to be like, oh wow, I've got to rethink some stuff. But no, we'll just pick him up, it'll be fine. Like no one's going to
Dust
say
him
anything.
off, just kind of like give him a quick spit shine, like just.
But that's one of the things that got me thinking as I read this about how there is something, not just these Philistines, but throughout the Bible, there's this kind of hard-heartedness. And sometimes it's portrayed as like a willful, almost like an obstinate toddler stamping their feet, like, no, I don't want to, kind of thing.
Mm.
But sometimes it's just a naivety. Like sometimes we're not easily moved by the things that ought to move us. And this is such an example of this. And you're kind of, the mind boggles to think, you know, why are the Philistines being so nearsighted? And yet we can totally be like this. Like, I'm sure we've all had our like seniors moments where we're like, oh, that was really dumb. And so, yeah, and then it's kind of, I don't know, it makes me think there's a warning in this to not be dumb, to like pay attention. But the warning is couched in, well, it's kind of the two sides of the coin where there's grace, because God actually repeats his warning to them. And actually, as the story progresses, God shows them a ton of grace. But also, like, ultimately, they suffer judgment on their actions. And so there's this kind of assurance, like, you will reap what you sow, but the safety net is that God's going to try to help you not reap bad stuff. Like, he wants to actually communicate to you. And so, yeah, that's an interesting, it's a pattern, you know. I guess it sets an expectation. Like if I was praying with someone and they're like, yeah, my life's just falling apart, like everything's going horribly. It could just be coincidence, it could be that just, life's full of brokenness and you've got like a couple of bucket loads of it right now. But it would be interesting to then walk through like, okay, what's God been saying to you the last year? Is God been trying to communicate? Like, what's he been trying to say? Is there something you're supposed to have heeded that you've missed? And so, yeah, because this pattern it repeats so much in scripture that, pastorally, I think it creates a bit of a picture for us to put ourselves in the story. But hopefully we don't go as bad as the Philistines or as Dagon.
For real.
Yeah. Oh, it's worth mentioning as well, the hands and head cut off is like in the ancient Near East, that was a form of ritual execution. So it's like day one, Dagon is submitted, like on his face, powerless before Yahweh, and they try and stand him back up again as if like they're the hand in the puppet of Dagon. Man, this would be like awesome with puppets. But they I have to introduce puppets. And they put him back up and like, no, I won't serve you. I am the strongest. And God's like, okay, you're going to be proud here? Well, then I will execute you. Like, I will just show how powerful you are. There you are. You have no power. Like, it's a really bold statement.
Interesting.
But then you get the Philistines. So then, because this dead God who's been shown to be powerless, the hands of his statue bounce across the threshold. Now they won't step on the threshold. So again, like you would think this would make them rethink things, but instead they're like, even in being shown their God is powerless, they're like, oh, don't step on the threshold. That's where Dagon died. So we shouldn't step on that. It's just kind of what a bizarre way to act. To still honor a God that you've been shown is powerless.
Yeah.
But that's kind of like the Egyptians as well.
Oh yeah.
Right? There's and it's I think it's probably easier for us because we tend to think of religions as like, oh yeah, there's all of these gods and religions out there, and we live in this pluralistic society, and you just try and figure out which one you think is true and pick one. Whereas in the ancient world, even if your God was like not as powerful as you hoped he was still your God because he was the God of this land and your people. And so that's one of the interesting things where it feels like God's banging his head up against the wall of, dudes, like you can change your allegiance. You can actually follow me. Like I'm the real God. And he really wants them to know I'm the real God. And he even works into all the laws of Israel how to accept people that want to change their allegiance. But they just can't wrap their head around like, yeah, but our theology says that like God is tied to us as a people and our history and this land and this place. And God's constantly bumping into the bad theology, which is then interesting that he's going to all these lengths to communicate. Like he doesn't just want to stand there and stamp his feet and be like, I'm the best, follow me. But he wants them to learn so that it can open the opportunity for them to change their allegiance. So it's like our God is a teaching God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amber, you've been very quiet.
Yeah, I think
This is your favorite story. I want to hear what you like.
I mean, I don't want to skip ahead, but as we keep reading chapter 5, it's just, to me, it's just so interesting that these people, this other nation just has really no idea at this point in the story what's going on. They know as we keep going, we'll see that they know something is connected to the ark, and they're just kind of freaking out. And if you, when you read it all together like we are, you really see that there's just like this panic in the way that they're responding. It's like confusion and panic and a lack of understanding of what's happening. And then in chapter 6, we'll see at the beginning next week that they finally get it a little bit more. And it's like they almost develop this reverence for the ark without really realizing what's going on. So I don't know, the story is just really interesting to me that these people have the presence of God in their midst and are just so panicked over what's happening and just really don't understand what's going on, despite the fact that God is that Yahweh God is right in the middle of them. And I think this first part is it's one of my favorite stories because it just really puts on display how powerful Yahweh is in comparison to the gods that the nations are serving. And by the end of this story, you really see that the Lord did come out on top of it all, despite this in-between process. Like it looks at this point like Israel's been defeated because the ark's gone, but the Lord really can handle himself. There's no human intervention on Israel's part really that gets the ark back. It's God doing what's necessary. So even when so it's like almost as if when things feel hopeless, God doesn't, he chooses us. He chooses to use us. He doesn't need us. And that's a big deal. I mean, that God can handle history on his own, and chooses us is a huge honor, but it's also really comforting to know that when things feel chaotic, like you get at the end of chapter 4 and you're like, things are just chaotic, and you read through where the ark gets passed around and you're like, things just feel chaotic. Yeah. God is just steady and consistent through all of it, eventually getting, in this instance, his presence back to where it should be in the story. And I think that speaks volumes to where we can be when things feel chaotic and when we feel like we just can't see 5 feet in front of us. God's steady. He's consistent. He doesn't need us to be stable and calm and collected in order for him to still do what he needs to do to move history and salvation forward. So it's unfortunate that there was so much chaos going on surrounding the ark. That's not obviously what the presence of God was supposed to do. But the lack of recognition is what kind of allowed for the space for things to progress back to where they needed and to
especially be. Like as a contrast with Dagon, who needed picking up.
Mm-hmm.
So the vast chasm between Yahweh and any other way. But I'm going to read a bit more because it'd be really nice to get to I don't know. Actually, chapters 5 and 6 kind of come together a little bit, but I don't know if that would be biting off more than we can chew tonight. All right, I'm going to read a bit more though. So the Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation upon them and afflicted them with tumors. When the men of Ashdod saw what was happening, they said, "The ark of the God of Israel must not stay here with us, because his hand is heavy upon us and upon Dagon our God." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and asked them, "What shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel?" They answered, "Have the ark of the God of Israel moved to Gath." So they moved the ark of the God of Israel. But after they'd moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. As the ark of God was entering Ekron, the people cried out, "They've brought the ark of the God of Israel around to kill us and our people." So they called together all the rulers of the Philistines and said, "Send the ark of the God of Israel away. Let it go back to its own place, or it'll kill us and our people." For death had filled the city with panic. God's hand was heavy, very heavy upon it. Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven. I love this. It's like the ultimate hot potato, isn't it?
Yeah.
You would think as soon as the like recognition of the essentially plague of tumors, that they would say like clear, that they would have not just said clearly the hand of the Lord of the Israelites is upon us. Let's, you know, they would have said more than that. You would have thought that they would say, okay, give it back. Like this is like the ultimate, you know, your brother had it first sort of scenario. Give it back to the Israelites. This is theirs. This is not ours. Like, I don't know what they were expecting passing it around like this. I mean, they're doing their own people damage. You would think that they would want to just get rid of it, you know, not understanding the kavod of the presence of the Lord, the weight of the heaviness. Because I just think it's interesting in verse 7, it says, because his hand is strongly against us. So you're getting that strength again. The word's not kavod there, but it's still the same idea of just, there's just this presence, this heavy presence.
Yeah.
And it's like, you think that they would have gotten it, but they just keep passing it around. I mean, either just decide and say, clearly this is the true God of the, you know, the God of gods, the ultimate Lord. But instead they just keep, yeah, like you said, hot potatoing it around until finally they're like, get rid of it. Just send it back. This is not, clearly we can't just continue to try to claim this victory. We have to give back, you know, in their minds, the God of Israel, for failing to recognize Yahweh's pervasive rulership clearly in this instance, because there's no doubt that that there would be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they don't like, he's against strongly in verse 7, strongly against us and our God Dagon. So as they're moving it to these other cities, there's likely other gods in these other cities. So, and we don't get the anecdotes of all of what's happening or where the ark's put, but it's not like the ark's sitting in fields in these other cities. Likely the ark is being put in the temples of these other cities as well. Yeah. And so this just constant failure to recognize that Yahweh God doesn't share primacy, that he is supreme over all, is just fascinating. And that they just, again, it's just that density, kind of like what we've been seeing all through 1 Samuel so far. It's this numbness to what really the presence of God, what that really looks like and who he is. And yeah.
It's interesting. It's almost like, oh, I've got this nuclear bomb and it's about to go off. Oh, that's bad. Let's put it next door. Like, because that'll make it okay. But then I'm remembering, like, the Philistines were actually kind of 5 kingdoms in a bit of a collective. And so I wonder whether these cities actually represent 3 out of the 5 sort of clans of the Philistines. So maybe they're like, because there's a persistence, and this is like human pride. You know, we often have that, like, human pride is just thinking you're right kind of thing. But I think it's also displayed in like a doggedness to try to get what you want, even if it's not. It's basically like repentance avoidance. Is a great way, because there's a mirroring, there's an echo of the Israelites moving the ark in the first place here. They brought the ark to the battle because they were like, oh, we got defeated. Yahweh he didn't help us. There must be a problem. Oh, well, let's bring the ark. Let's manipulate God. And then here we are again, like, oh, there must be a problem. Oh, well, let's move the ark. Let's manipulate God. And then you're going to get the same thing over and over. And so I think a huge part of these early chapters is God just showing, like, dudes, I can't be manipulated.
Yeah.
I can be obeyed, but I can't be manipulated.
Yeah.
And you can talk to me. And when they try to honor God, God actually honors them trying to honor him, even though it's 7 shades of bad. Like, they didn't do a good job of it, but yeah. So yeah, I think it's interesting that they're kind of failing in the same way the Israelites did. When they should be repenting and changing, Instead, they're trying to find some way to make it work still.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's interesting because humans were built to like be creative and solve problems and go spread God's mission across earth, right?
Right.
And so there's something in us that's supposed to problem solve. And yet here you've got people using this ability to actually withstand what God's trying to do. And so it's sort of, there's something really tragic about the misuse of our humanity in this story, which is another interesting thing.
And I think the result of the misuse of our humanity is just is comical. I mean, when we try to do it on our own, when you read the whole story together, I mean, I'm sure it didn't feel funny to them. But when we look at it in condensed form like this, it's like, man, they just, when we try to do things the way we understand them, we really don't get it. I mean, things do not work out the way that we anticipate them going. Because our knowledge is finite and we're dense. I mean, as humans, we don't always get it right, and we rarely get it right the first time. I don't know how many times, I didn't count, but there's a couple, they got it wrong a couple of times. And yeah, I mean, we'll see in chapter 6, God did honor their trying to get it right. I mean, in a strange kind of way, of their trying to get it right. Their recognition, at least, that Yahweh was not going to share a temple with another god, and was not going to share the allegiance of the Philistine people with other gods. Their recognition of that, there seems to be a little bit of grace there on God's part in letting that progress. But it's unfortunate that people had to die and that people had to be afflicted for them to get it. But at the same time, the Lord can't be manipulated, and he can't be maneuvered around as if he is just another image to be put along with the rest.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that they sent it, like their plan B was to send it to Gath, because Gath was actually an occupied Israelite city that the Philistines had taken over. So, people have wondered, were they thinking, oh, well, there's like a strong Israelite presence there in the population still, so maybe that will like solve the problem because God won't kill his own people or something.
God just wants to be in some form of his hometown sort of thing.
Yeah. So it's like they're trying. I mean, it's pretty ingenious. They're trying all these different things, apart from the really, really obvious, like, our God doesn't work, this one does. Maybe we should rethink things again, Akin has asked on Facebook, like, about how the priests seem to have insight to know why it is that there are these problems. Because you might expect a pagan priest to be clueless about what's going on. But actually, we'll keep reading here, but as the story unfolds, you see that these priests, they have bad theology, but they do have some theology in them.
Yeah.
Like, they know a bit about Yahweh. It's like they don't have the complete truth. They know, oh, we're supposed to do some sort of guilt offering, but they don't do it right.
Right.
Oh yeah, like, this is the God who afflicted Egypt, and so we should do this. But they don't quite get the story of what the whole Egypt thing was about, correct? Yeah. And so that's, again, interesting, like, talking about God being a teaching God. You can see the effectiveness of God trying to reach Egypt has had on the rest of the world. And that's like, that's not just here, that's throughout loads of the history of the Old Testament. Like, other nations are like, oh yeah, God's like, we know about Yahweh. We know a little bit about what he's done. And yeah.
And I think that's interesting too, because when you read in Deuteronomy, the people of Israel were supposed to model the ways of Yahweh in a way that the nations saw and recognized. Mm-hmm. So we even see a little bit of it here. The reputation of the Lord precedes him wherever the Israelites go. Like, even with the ark, it says by the time they got to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, "They've moved the ark of Israel's God to us." So even in this instance, the Lord's reputation is still preceding his actual movement there. And so I think that's interesting that we do see, like, this like vague idea of who the Lord is and his people. But it makes me wonder, because the people, the other nations were supposed to recognize and know the Lord because of the way that Israel lived, because of their obedience and their fidelity to him and his ways. And so you have to wonder, when we see kind of this partial understanding, how the Israelites were living to allow a partial understanding to be what's known, because the Lord is supposed to be known based on how he moves and then how his people act. So how he moves clearly has preceded him, but how are his people living among the other nations as they've, inherited their land, as we get out of Joshua and Judges? How are these people living among the Philistines? Not obviously not necessarily conquered by, but they're neighboring these other nations. Why hasn't more of the Lord's reputation spread out so that there's more of a widespread understanding of, no, this is this, like, to the point where the Philistines wouldn't have captured the ark or wouldn't have put it in the temple, because they would have known, like, no, we know the way Israel worships their God. We know because of their witness to just their lifestyle and their service and devotion and obedience. So it just makes me think about that as I'm reading this and going, yes, they understood because the Lord is known, and he's done powerful things among the nations, but that wasn't the only way he was to be known among the nations. It's an interesting thing. It's beautiful because there's that partnership, right, where God wants to be known through his people. But that also places a little bit of responsibility on his people to stay connected in that partnership and to stay responsive to the action and the call and their fidelity to the Lord. So it's different in our time, but there's some similarities in how we represent our God. But and
again, what they're trying is this blend of what to them was religious common sense and the little scraps of good theology they had.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, moving Yahweh from place to place, they thought that gods ruled over small geographical areas. So they're thinking, like, well, maybe God's not happy here, let's move him. So from their point of view, that totally makes sense. Like, you can probably fix this problem by getting the right God in the right box. And so, but it's interesting because, there's another big, conversation that could be had here about how it comes to the point. God doesn't make them suffer to start with, but their hard-heartedness, like the next move is like, oh, we're going to have to use suffering to get through to you. And things come to a climax when things get so bad. And it's this telling phrase that the outcry went up to heaven. Because again, that's Exodus language.
Yep.
That God has heard the cry of his people. And so, it's kind of picturing humanity as being really hard to get through to. Because that, I haven't actually checked this in the Hebrew, but in Exodus, the word like to cry out, that the cry that's heard in heaven is the same, is a really emotive word used of like a woman who cries out because she's being raped. It's someone who's feeling violated. Like it's a really extreme word. So it's really interesting language there, that things have to get really bad. Should we carry on and see how the story finishes?
Yes, real fast. I do want to say a quick thing. By the time we get that Exodus reference in verse 12 is after they say what the proper thing that should have been done with the ark.
Yeah.
It isn't, because they're pretty distressed prior to now, but by this point it's after they realize, let it return to its place so it won't kill us and our people. It's at that point that we get that Exodus reference. It's not that God wasn't listening before, but their lack of acknowledgement of what they had, they just didn't recognize, and they still don't fully, but it was once they realized, like, this is not what we should be doing.
And actually, that's really interesting because this again gets mirrored in chapter 6. So when the Israelites get struck because they don't interact with the ark properly, instead of repenting, the thing they're upset about is that they've been whacked, is that they've been suffered. What they want is not to put the relationship right with God. What they want is to just deal with the circumstances. And the Philistines are the same here. You know, they're not actually repenting. They're not trying to change their allegiance. But, you know, they're not understanding the context of them, Dagon and Yahweh. They just want the circumstances put right.
Yeah.
And that's, man, that's huge, right? We can be so prone to slipping from a relationship with God to just trying to manage our circumstances and seeing God as a tool to help us achieve that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and that's not much different than the way that people responded at the Exodus. I mean, the people are, you know, it seems that the people want to be in the right relationship with their God and serve him once again. And, you know, they finally escape the Egyptians. They make it across the Red Sea. And then, you know, you get this interim chapter of like Moses singing a song of praise. And then immediately following is people being like, we're hungry, we're thirsty. Like, remember the good old days when we were enslaved by Egypt? Like, yeah, we worked hard, but they at least fed us. And it was like, what? So you're not happy because it's just not perfect. Like, you don't have exactly what you want, how you want it. Like, it doesn't matter that you're serving a God who cares for you and loves you, and that like you don't want to do anything right. You just want to have everything the way you want it.
Yeah.
It's just our nature.
Well, and that's the Genesis 2, Genesis 3 tension. We were created to work, but the work wasn't going to be frustrating to us. And then the effect of the fall is that we're still called to work, but the ground is going to fight back. And so instead of making our peace with that, we want some kind of shortcut back to the garden, which scripture is littered, right, with people trying to shortcut back to the garden. Or create their own version of the garden, right? So yeah, it's interesting. There's a big theme, scriptural theme. All right, I'm going to read the first bit of chapter 6. This I love these books. I like the literary genius of these stories and all of the plays on words and just being brilliant, awesome stories. Okay.
Yeah.
So when the ark of the Lord had been in the Philistine territory 7 months, the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and said, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place." They answered, "If you return the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it away empty, but by all means send a guilt offering to him. Then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has not been lifted from you." The Philistines asked, "What guilt offering should we send to him?" They replied, 5 gold tumors, 5 gold rats, according to the number of the Philistine rulers, because the same plague had struck both you and the rulers. Make models of the tumors and the rats that are destroying the country, and pay honor to Israel's God. Perhaps he will lift his hand from you and your gods and your land. Why do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh did when he treated them harshly? Did they not send the Israelites out so they could go on their way? Now then, get a new cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart, but take their calves away and pen them up. Take the ark of the Lord, put it on a cart, and in a chest beside it, put the gold objects you are sending back as a guilt offering. Send it on its way, but keep watching it. If it goes up to its own territory toward Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, and it happened by chance. So they did this. They took 2 such cows, hitched them up to the cart, and penned up their calves, placed the ark of the Lord on the cart, along with the chest containing the gold rats and the model of the tumors. Then the cows went straight up toward Beth Shemesh, keeping on the road and lowing all the way, and did not turn to the right or the left. And the rulers of the Philistines followed them as far as the border of Beth Shemesh. that's a lot, but I wanted to read the whole.
Description of it happening. Yeah.
The author
Yeah,
wants
get
you
the
to
whole thing.
know at that last part that there was not a single solitary chance that that ark was not heading straight for Beth Shemesh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it went straight away. It did not turn. Do I need to say it a third time? Like there was no movement to the right or the left.
Yeah.
So you, I mean, one is, as you know, ancient people reading this text go, yep, we don't have to doubt that that's what happened.
Yeah.
And for us, we can go, yeah, clearly God's making a point.
And this is interesting, right? Because they really, really want to get rid of the ark, or at
Mhm.
least some of the people do, but the rulers don't, because it's to their dishonor and their God's dishonor if they can't contain Yahweh,
Mm.
who, of course, can't be contained.
Naturally.
And here's the interesting thing. If I wanted to test God, like, do you really want me to do this? You know, I really want to get rid of the ark, but, you know, is that for sure what I should do? If I really wanted to get rid of it, I'd make it really easy for God to say, yes, get rid of the ark. But they don't, they make it really hard. So, like, you got 2 cows who've never been yoked. So for 2 cows to pull something together takes training.
Yeah.
So you've got untrained cows who, for some reason, just automatically operate as a team and stay on the road and overcome their maternal instinct. So they head out towards Beth Shemesh and they can hear their calves that they've been forced to leave behind. And instead of heading for their calves, they head to Beth Shemesh. It's like the extremity of this test is pretty profound. It's almost comical that then the cows just hightail it out of town straight for Beth Shemesh. So it's a real, I think it's almost like the Dagon thing, right? Dagon falls over. Oh, I'm not sure you get it. Was that an accident? Let's rinse and repeat. No, definitely not an accident.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing. Like, no, this is definitely not, like, there's no 2 ways about it. This is not an accident.
And it's almost comical as well when we see at the end of verse 12, the Philistine rulers were walking behind them. Like, it almost seems like they're like, oh, I don't know. Like, it just evokes this picture of their uncertainty and their submission to what's happening, rather than them just saying, we're going to just send it away and we are not really that concerned. Like, they clearly, though they don't want to necessarily admit it, it's pretty clear that they are submitted to the process, despite the fact that they don't really want it to be the way that they assume and that it actually is.
It's like the edge has been taken off their pride, but they still haven't done quite the right thing.
Mhm.
But yeah, the edge has been taken off.
And is it really? And I think, I mean, obviously, thousands of years later, looking back, like, did it really save their pride? Because it seems pretty humbling to walk behind the 2 cows pulling this cart, wondering where it's going to go. I mean, I feel like it would have been maybe even less humiliating to just return it with yourselves, because they're clearly behind it, so they're clearly returning it themselves. But in this, like, inconspicuous, we're gonna just kind of see and, like, roll the dice with fate. So to me it looks just as humiliating for them, despite their effort to make it this, let's see what happens. They clearly are still very involved in this process.
It doesn't look good for them, you're right.
No.
Oh, but there's this kind of glimmer of hope, because they do engage this idea of, like, oh, we should honor Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't understand that they should just fully honor Yahweh, and he's the only one that needs honoring.
Yeah.
But it's like there's a glimmer of hope, but it's kind of tragic because the seed hasn't quite grown into the right plant yet. I find it really interesting at the beginning here that the Philistines call for the priests, not just the priests and the diviners, who Israel are explicitly warned that they are never to consult because God hates them and they are an abomination. So the Philistines go ask the diviner, and here's like the irony of this is, like, Israel failed, and their theological failure leads to the ark's capture. It, like, shows how far they've slumped. because Israel is portrayed as making just the same mistakes the Philistine does in some different ways.
Yeah.
But the Philistines, like where truth starts to enter the Philistine story, is from the mouths of the people who God says never consult because they're an abomination. It's like the worst possible source. So, yeah, I think there's some real comic irony in the way this story is being told, where we're supposed to laugh in disbelief, but then that comedy turns into just showing us how dark Israel has gotten when Israel is copying the Philistines' ways, the ways that came out of the mouths of the people you really shouldn't listen to, you know?
Mhm.
Yeah. But they get like they're partially right. Like we should honor God. Okay. We should do a guilt offering. Good. But what's a guilt offering supposed to be? Oh, well, we'll make gold images. No, sorry, that's prohibited. Like God said, you should never do that. Like, so yeah, they get it cataclysmically wrong. But here's the interesting thing, right? And they're touching the ark. The ark's supposed to be carried by hand. It's never supposed to be put on a cart,
Mhm.
right? And so, like, their intention is to honor God, but they completely mess up the how. And it's really interesting to me that instead of striking them dead left, right, and center, no harm comes to the Philistines through the rest of this story. It's like they've made one tiny nudge Godward.
Yeah.
And God allows them to just see some fruit from that, even though it's horrifically wrong. Which is such a contrast because the Israelites do stuff wrong and God's like, no, like, I told you not to do that. Like, you should know. Like, he's holding, that's that holding them to a different standard thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We talked about the whole pride, hardening of heart thing, but there's something to dwell on with the verse in the middle that's like, don't harden your hearts like the Egyptians. Like the warning against pride. But again, because we don't want to suffer the way that the Egyptians did.
Yeah.
So it's circumstantial in a way. It's honoring God for the sake of gain rather than for the sake of worship.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, they're staggeringly wrong. But I think it's so interesting that they, do the right thing. Or get the right result, I should say. The result is they're okay, and the Lord's put back where he should be. Yeah. Even the 7 months is telling, because 7's that number of completion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like when God's time of exile was fully up.
Yep.
And the Israelite nation had the complete time where God wanted to like leave them alone to figure some stuff out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So see, there's this sense in which God's providentially, this isn't just happenstance, but God's got a plan in the midst of all of this. Like things are working themselves out in the complete way he wants them to.
Yeah. It's crazy how easily that we're able to skip over that timeline too. Like that's a long time for Israel to not have the ark, and I mean we don't get a sense of what the people of Israel are doing here or how they're handling this.
Well, this is we can associate with us, right? We got locked down, so we can't go to church the way we normally do and do churchy stuff the way we normally do. Now imagine we can't do it digitally either.
Yeah.
You know, and just try and strip away as much of that as we can, and then imagine it not being 2 months but 7 months, and think the profound effect that would have on us.
Yeah.
And then moving forward even into the rest of 6, or in the beginning of 7, before it takes a long time for the ark to be returned to the temple where it really belongs. So
Mhm.
7 months is just when it's not in among God's
Among the
people.
people, yeah.
But then it's even longer before it's restored to where God's presence is supposed to be among the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder whether a part of this is one of these speculative, we don't know things, but I wonder whether part of God's plan here is actually to take his hand off Israel, who've got this really corrupt idea of their religion, and just let it deteriorate and almost return. Although Samuel's still active during this term, but it's interesting that during these 7 months, we don't see Samuel in the story.
Yeah.
So then it almost creates a kind of like, all right, all of the echoes of what Eli was doing have faded away. Right, now let's start building,
Mhm.
Yeah, we just don't
Start
know.
over anew, start from scratch.
I want to
Yeah.
know what Samuel's thinking about all of this. That's what I wish.
Yeah,
I wish we were given that.
You wonder if Samuel has a sense of peace about it because he's actually the one person listening to God among the people of Israel, as far as we know.
Not to skip
Yeah.
ahead, but in 7 we see a little bit of his response, and you can kind of see that there almost is that sense of like, do you see what has happened and why this is taking place?
Mhm.
It's almost like he recognized. I mean, well, we saw earlier in this book that he was the only one who really understood the voice of the Lord correctly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's what was kind of what he was doing, how he was feeling as this was taking place.
Mhm.
Mhm.
All right. Should we read to the end of the chapter here?
I say so.
Yeah.
Finish it. I read the last bit, didn't I? Who hasn't read any?
Wanna read?
Yeah, I'll read the last bit here, starting in verse 13. Now the people of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and when they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark, they rejoiced to see it. The cart came into the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh and stopped there. A great stone was there, and they split up the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was beside it, in which were the golden figures, and set them upon the great stone. And the men of Beth Shemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrificed sacrifices on that day to the Lord. And when the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they returned that day to Ekron. These are the golden tumors that the Philistines returned as a guilt offering to the Lord: one for Ashdod, one for Gaza, one for Ashkelon, one for Gath, and one for Ekron. And the golden mice, according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines belonging to the 5 lords, both fortified cities and unwalled villages. The great stone beside which they set down the ark of the Lord is a witness to this day in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh. And he struck some of the men of Beth Shemesh because they looked upon the ark of the Lord. He struck 70 men of them, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great blow. Then the men of Beth Shemesh said, "Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? And to whom shall he go up away from us?" So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you."
And then real fast, my translation has the first verse of chapter 7, which says, "So the people of Kiriath Jearim came for the ark of the Lord, took it to Abinadab's house on the hill. They consecrated his son Eleazar to take care of it."
Yeah. Which is then a good pausing point in the story.
I think this is so fun for me because you see this ending and you think, oh God, they're going to repeat it, because you see people are struck down and then they're like, no, get rid of it. And you're like, no, wait, we just saw this. Like, don't just throw the ark around. That's not going to work. But we're pleasantly surprised that so the people came for the ark. You see this in 7:1, and they consecrated Eleazar to take care of it. So clearly they get it. They consecrate someone. They take.
And this is the first time in the story of the ark someone's done something right.
Yeah,
right.
And it's such a relief that you're seeing, like, oh my gosh, I was so worried we were about to repeat what we just saw a chapter ago.
Yeah.
And instead it's still not quite the way it's supposed to be, but we're so much closer than we were back in 5.
Yeah.
This response is already way more reverent, way more aware of the necessary consecration of the presence and the weightiness of
Mhm.
God's glory than the Philistines were in 5. So it's
That's
just
right.
like,
I mean,
thankfully.
you highlight consecration. That's it, right? Instead of trying to manipulate God or control the situation, they respond instead of trying to control.
Right.
And they're like, oh, God's holy, like he's in charge, he's God, we should consecrate ourselves and just honor him.
Yeah.
It's like, let's give God back the initiative, and he's the main actor in the story. And it's not quite repentance, but it's the right kind of attitude, whereas everyone else has tried to manipulate their way out of the situation.
Right.
And here's like the ending of that. And it's cool. It's going to take ages before we get to the point in the story, right? But God starts to really bless, and there's a pouring out of blessing because here's a place where he's being honored rightly. But that's chapters and chapters away.
It's a step in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction. We're seeing the chaos moving more slowly, but progressively towards the repentance and restoration of the ark.
And that's maybe like, because the story is going to pivot back a bit to like Samuel, but it's painting a picture for us like what was the nation like, and it's that verse here at the beginning of chapter 7 is like there's a glimmer of hope, but the backdrop is we've been shown how God doesn't just care about Israel but cares about the world. But that the Philistines are in a really dark place, and Israel generally is in pretty much as bad of a place as the Philistines are, because your same pattern, they do everything wrong. Like it's almost like the guilt offering thing. They're like, oh, we should sacrifice. Oh yeah, good idea. We'll sacrifice the cows. No. You're only allowed to sacrifice bulls. You're not allowed to sacrifice cows. So you've done that wrong. And like, oh, the ark, well, we'll put it on the rock. Like, let's put it there and just, glory. And it's, no one's supposed to look at it. Like, first thing you should have done, dudes, is not put it on a rock as a spectacle, but you should have covered it up. And then like, what should we put next to it? Oh, let's put the gold images that are an abomination to God next to it. So it's like, there's this like little bit of like, you've got some of the right ideas, but this is going horribly wrong. And then, God has to like show them, dudes, this is not right.
Yeah.
And their response, and here's the dark part, I think the darkest dark part, is not just that they were wrong, but when God tries to communicate with them, they do what the Philistines do. Like, oh, I don't want to be told I'm wrong. I don't want to suffer. And I don't want to change the way I'm doing it. Let's get rid of this.
Yeah.
This source of me learning I'm wrong and being forced to confront the need to change. I want to push that away and get rid of that.
Yeah.
Which is, and that's the pride again.
Unfortunate.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate too, because the ark was never like, the Lord didn't, when the ark was made and placed in the tabernacle, the purpose was not to bring distress and chaos among people. Like, this was never what God wanted. God didn't want his presence to be a source of stress and a source of death or a source of all of this. This was not what he wanted. He wanted to dwell among his people, that his people would be a light to then bring the nations in, that all people would worship and experience presence with their creator. But misused and mishandled, it's I mean, God is so gracious with us that he's still that at this point in the story that he's still present among his people, because this is a complete misuse of what he was going for. And it really is tragic to see just the lack of understanding of God's people, not comprehensively, but in this instance, if they're just not quite getting it. And then like I said earlier, the neighboring nations, that we got to remember as we're reading these stories, this was not the way it's supposed to be. And we already kind of know that. I mean, looking at Eli and looking at Eli's family, and the way that the priesthood was being dealt with at that time. But even in this instance, with the presence of God is heavy, it's weighty, it's full of glory, but it's supposed to be a source of life.
Yeah.
That heaviness and glory is supposed to be life-giving. It is when it's placed properly.
Yeah.
And we're getting there, but it's crazy. It's crazy to see just the progression of how this goes. And I get it. When you read stories like this in the Old Testament, you get why God said not to make images in his, to make golden statues in his image. And why he says don't make idols, because clearly this isn't even an image of God. The ark is not like what God looks like. This is just a symbol of the presence of God.
Mhm.
And they still are like, yeah, let's, like you said, Richard, let's put it, let's behold it, let's put it on this rock, and it's like they're already kind of not getting it, and it's not even what God
and all of those things they're doing wrong are the things the Philistines did.
Yes, right.
Again, so and I think it's that juxtaposition at the end here of the two responses to, like, how are we going to deal with this ark, which, man, you bump into this dynamic over and over. So, like, they say, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, this holy God? Who can possibly make this work? Well, apparently Abinadab and Eleazar and the men of Kiriath Jearim. Like, it wasn't hard, dudes.
Yeah.
You know, so and that's the interesting thing about pride. They tried to do it their way and got so frustrated when it didn't work,
Right.
that they drew the conclusion that it was impossible. And, like, I mean, we've all had conversations with people and probably had moments where we've done something like this, where it's like, yeah, I don't feel like I connect with God. Well, what do you do to try and connect with God? Well, I expect him to show up in my day and manifest himself. What are you doing? Any of the things God has said to do? No, but it's just not working. Like, it's just impossible. I just don't think God's really there for me.
Yeah. And
it's like, well, that's not a problem with God. It's a problem with pride.
Right.
And there's so many, man, we're so prone to it, aren't we? It's like there's probably been a bit of today when, if we thought about it and prayed about it, all three of us would be like, oh yeah, that's right. After lunch, I acted a bit that way. Like, it's a propensity we just have to be so wary of, because you see how easily it can just cut you off from the possibility of fruitfulness. Yeah. And it takes humility to recognize that pride too, and say, all right, now it's time to readjust. Yeah. And then you start ourselves as the prophets start to comment on all of this history, and really they're commenting on humanity, why God is so put in the foreground. Like, my dudes, humility, that's the thing. Like, yeah, putting that in the foreground, like you say, Amber. All right, well, we did 2 chapters.
This is fun. Didn't feel that long.
No, that was a little longer tonight, and so I'm going to say the same thing said at the end of last week. We've got all these recordings on YouTube if you missed a chapter and you enjoy it. And if you're watching this not live and you're like, I had a question, that's okay. Comment. We'll check the comments and we'll pick it up next week.
Yes.
So there we go. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
God bless. Love you.
Bye.